anatomically in one particular lobe of the brain. There's one theory that still is out there. It sort of originated with Freud, and then another psychoanalyst, Ernst Kriss, wrote a lot on this balancing of two different processes, two different psychological processes. One is a primary process, and those are sort of very concrete, emotion-driven visual processes, like dreaming is that state, hallucinations are that state. People who are actually psychotic have really just are thought to have just the primary processes. It's just this uncontrolled primary process that they have. So that's one aspect of it, and then that's to be balanced with the secondary process, which is kind of abstract, language-driven, very logical, and it's really thought to be people who kind of play back and forth between the two of these are able to be quite creative. And so it's, like I said, this balancing between primary and secondary processes. Like I said, this is an old theory, but it's one that still is referred to frequently. And I think it's very interesting if you look at this, you know, these primary processes, emotional, visual, that sounds like what I was just talking about in terms of right brain function. Language-driven, logical, very linear, that's kind of fits with secondary processes. And it's interesting, these are very different theories, but the conclusion in terms of creativity has been that it really is the interplay between primary and secondary processes, or left brain and right brain, where art really emerges. And then another just very fascinating neurological syndrome, not a disease, a lot of people have this and don't have any disease in association, is synesthesia. And that's where you have one sensation like sound, and when you take in the sound, you have a perception of something else like color or shapes. And I imagine there are a lot of artists in the room here today, and some of you might actually have some synesthesia. This is a quotation from a very well-known person who had an amazing memory. He actually wasn't able to function well in the world because he had such a good memory. And part of how he could remember was he had this amazing synesthesia. This is just a quotation. Ah is somewhat white and long. E moves off somewhere ahead so that you just can't sketch it, whereas ye is pointed in form. U is also pointed and sharper than ye. This is just a brief quotation. People who have this, a lot of them seem to be hypergraphic also. They go on and on about just their associations with everything. I think it's sort of a release for them because it's something sort of different that's happening in their brain. So colored hearing, in terms of hearing things and seeing colors, that's about 0.2% of the population. There's a much simpler version of that where high-pitched noises are seen as being bright, low-pitched noises as dark, and that's fairly common, that very simple form of synesthesia. But the more complex colored hearing, that's the most common form, is 0.2%. Tends to run in families, women more than men. And it might be that there are different parts of the brain, like the visual and auditory part of the brain, that may be some very small connections in most people, and then people with synesthesia may have more prominent connections between the different sensory parts of the brain. And you can certainly see how that would lead to enhanced creativity, to be connecting different sensory modalities, have an enhanced connection between them. So Vladimir Nabokov, the writer, clearly had synesthesia. Kandinsky, Scriabin, Rimbaud wrote poetry about his experience of synesthesia. So it's quite, it appears to be more common among, certainly among very talented artists. So that's, those are different neurological conditions and how they can affect artistic ability and creativity. Now, specifically, in terms of MS, what do we know about MS in relation to art? And very little. That's being generous. We know essentially nothing. And I thought when we put this program together, I thought there'd be a little more out there, and there really are, there are a few attempts to sort of describe this area, but they're surprised they were even published as descriptions of the effect of MS on creativity. So we really know very little. It's interesting, one of the bits of information that is out there is something that came from some studies we did. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but we do have a website at the Rocky Mountain MS Center devoted to complementary and alternative medicine We do very large surveys involving thousands of people, and we did one on cognitive difficulties and asked people with MS what helped cognitive function the most. We have medications, there are various alternative approaches, and like I said, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but it was a surprise to us that music therapy was up at the top of the list, along with 2 medications that we sometimes use to enhance cognition or in the case of provigil fatigue, but it may have some overlap into cognitive function. So I think it's going to be interesting, your own observations of the program today, and I think we're interested to see what we can learn about MS and creativity in the arts. In terms of the arts generally, you can do that. It can be viewed as formal art therapy, but lots of different aspects of art can be thought of in terms of therapeutics. Dance, painting and visual arts, photography, film, writing, performing arts. So those first 4 are going to be covered in the program today. Also music, and then like I say, you can do it very formally with a trained art therapist, or most people will just kind of do it on their own. And the benefits are, one might be what's referred to as the emotional catharsis, just a release of emotion that might relate to disease, might relate to other things in your life. And that may relate to those primary processes, sort of unconscious emotions kind of rising to a somewhat conscious state and being able to express that at a more secondary level or more in the real world. That can be personal fulfillment, empowerment on being able to create art, participate in the process, just pure relaxation, just a recreational type activity, and then potentially, this really hasn't been studied well, but in terms of helping with various symptoms, there's some limited evidence for various art therapy helping with pain, maybe some beneficial effects in terms of mood difficulties, and then certainly if you're using your arms or legs and you have weakness or incoordination, there can be some beneficial effects there. So that's a broad overview, and like I say, this is it's been one of those grayest of the gray areas in terms of a formal understanding, and we now have techniques, MRI techniques, other technology that is going to uncover a lot of the underlying processes here. And in terms of if you have an interest here, this book is really outstanding. Alice Flaherty, she's a neurologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital. She also is a writer, and she also has hypergraphia and synesthesia, and she has psychiatric disease that's required hospitalization. And this book really is if it's rambling, it's kind of fascinating rambling that she does in terms of talking rigorously about neuroanatomy, creativity, and then her own personal experiences, and kind of mixing the whole thing together. It's really a fascinating book, and then I've got some other references there too. So with that, I'll finish. Thanks.